Imagine waking up one morning and the world's major cities have vanished. New York, London, Tokyo, Paris, Beijing, gone without a trace. The buildings, the people, the infrastructure, all wiped off the map in an instant. This thought experiment, while seeming like the plot of a science fiction novel, raises fascinating questions about what would happen to the world if its urban hubs disappeared overnight. First, let's understand the scope of such a monumental event. Major cities like New York, Tokyo, and Shanghai are not just home to millions of people, they are the engines that drive the global economy. Cities account for over 80% of global GDP, making them the economic lifeblood of modern society. These metropolises are hubs of culture, technology, and innovation. If they disappeared overnight, the ripple effects would be felt worldwide. Immediate shock. The human impact. The most immediate impact of the disappearance of major cities would be the staggering loss of human life. Over half the world's population, approximately 4.2 billion people, live in urban areas. Losing these cities would mean the sudden disappearance of billions of people. The shockwaves would reverberate across the globe. Beyond the human tragedy, societies in rural and smaller urban areas would face immense challenges. The disappearance of cities like New York and London, which serve as financial, cultural, and political centers, would create a leadership vacuum. Smaller towns and regions might try to fill the void, but the scale of resources and networks required would be almost insurmountable. Additionally, millions of people living in suburban or adjacent areas would face psychological trauma. Studies show that community displacement can result in increased anxiety and depression levels. Now imagine that trauma on a global scale, with entire populations losing their loved ones, connections, and livelihoods overnight. Economic collapse. A global crisis. Cities like New York, London, and Tokyo are not just densely populated, they are vital to the global economy. Together, the top 10 largest cities in the world generate approximately $13 trillion annually. With their sudden disappearance, the global economy would enter a downward spiral. Stock markets would crash, and international trade would come to a standstill. In 2021, global urban areas accounted for 60% of the world's energy consumption. The intricate systems that power cities, from transportation to electricity grids, would be thrown into disarray. Industries that rely heavily on city-based infrastructures, such as finance, tech, and manufacturing, would face massive disruptions. Global supply chains, already vulnerable as evidenced during the COVID-19 pandemic, would buckle under the pressure. A World Bank study found that urban centers contribute over 80% of global GDP. Without them, economic growth would plummet. The sudden loss of tax revenues would cripple governments, especially in developed nations. Social safety nets, like pensions and unemployment benefits, would disintegrate, leaving millions in precarious situations. The energy and infrastructure crisis. One of the most immediate consequences of losing the world's major cities is the collapse of global energy distribution. Urban areas consume vast amounts of energy, and many major cities are located near essential power grids, oil refineries, and transportation hubs. The disappearance of cities like Houston, a major hub for oil and gas, would send shockwaves through the energy sector. Approximately 90% of the world's data traffic flows through undersea cables, with major cities serving as crucial endpoints for this data. The loss of these cities would cripple the internet, potentially cutting off billions from digital access. Consider the fact that 45% of the world's GDP comes from the digital economy. The disappearance of cities would also shut down the servers, data centers, and communications networks that rely on urban infrastructure. Transportation networks, from airports to highways, would also be paralyzed. Global aviation, which connects people and goods across continents, would collapse overnight. With major cities gone, global trade would be severely hindered, leading to shortages in food, medicine, and essential goods. Environmental consequences. An unseen shift. The disappearance of cities would also have profound environmental consequences. Urban areas, while major contributors to pollution and carbon emissions, also serve as hubs for sustainability efforts. Cities are responsible for over 70% of global CO2 emissions. The sudden erasure of urban populations would lead to an immediate reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but at what cost? A sudden disappearance of cities would cause an initial environmental relief, but that relief might not last long. Without cities, critical infrastructure for managing waste, recycling, and water would be lost. The world would face the risk of environmental disasters from abandoned industrial sites, chemical plants, and refineries. Toxic substances might leak into surrounding environments, causing ecological harm that could last for decades. Interestingly, this scenario would spark debates about humanity's relationship with the environment. If cities, the epitome of human development, vanished, would nature start to reclaim urban areas? Studies on abandoned areas, like Chernobyl, show that nature can rebound remarkably fast when human intervention ceases. However, the scale of the urban disappearance would lead to unpredictable consequences in terms of habitat destruction and biodiversity shifts. Power struggles and political shifts. If the major cities of the world were to disappear overnight, the global political landscape would change drastically. In the absence of political capitals like Washington, London, and Beijing, there would be a scramble for power. Smaller nations and cities might seize the opportunity to exert influence, leading to geopolitical instability. It's important to note that major cities are also the heart of political governance. Washington, D.C., for example, is the nerve center of the US government. If it were to disappear, the power vacuum would be catastrophic. Who would take charge? Rural areas may not have the infrastructure or leadership to step in, and power struggles could ensue, leading to chaos and potential civil unrest. We might also see the emergence of new political orders. Historical examples show that power vacuums often lead to the rise of authoritarian regimes. After all, desperate times often lead to desperate measures. The disappearance of major cities could prompt military coups or authoritarian governments taking control in the name of restoring order. Human history is filled with examples of how quickly societies can turn to strong leaders during times of crisis. Social collapse, rebuilding society from the ground up beyond political shifts. The loss of cities would lead to social collapse. Cities are cultural melting pots, home to universities, museums, theaters, and centers of innovation. The disappearance of cities like Paris, Rome, and New York would lead to the loss of invaluable knowledge, art, and history. Major universities, which house the brightest minds, would be lost. Research into medicine, technology, and social sciences would come to an abrupt halt. This would set back human progress by decades, if not centuries. Cultural heritage sites, from the Eiffel Tower to the Statue of Liberty, would disappear, leaving behind an immense cultural void. Without cities, social networks would fray. A study by the Pew Research Center found that urban areas foster diversity and social mobility. The disappearance of these hubs would force people to retreat into smaller, more homogeneous communities, leading to increased social divisions. The vibrant exchange of ideas that cities nurture would vanish, replaced by insular, isolated communities. Food and agriculture, a looming crisis. Another immediate challenge would be food production and distribution. Cities are the endpoints of global supply chains that bring food from farms to tables. The sudden loss of these urban markets would create chaos in the agricultural sector. Without the cities to consume and distribute food, rural farmers would face financial ruin. The world would likely see widespread food shortages as agricultural networks collapse. In addition, many major cities are located near coastal areas and serve as key shipping ports. The disappearance of these ports would halt global trade, especially the transport of food. A study by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, found that nearly 80% of global food production is destined for urban markets. Without these cities, food prices would skyrocket, and millions could face famine. The psychological impact. A world without cities. It's hard to overstate the psychological impact of losing major cities. These urban hubs are more than just physical spaces, they are symbols of human achievement. The skyline of a city like New York represents ambition, innovation, and progress. The loss of such cities would create an immense emotional and psychological void. Psychologists have long studied the effects of displacement, and the loss of cities would lead to collective trauma. The disappearance of familiar landmarks, neighborhoods, and cultural institutions would result in a sense of loss that extends beyond the physical. People would struggle with their identity, no longer able to associate themselves with the cities they called home. The sense of security, belonging, and identity tied to cities would be shattered. The world would grapple with rebuilding not just its physical infrastructure but also its emotional and psychological foundations. This would lead to widespread anxiety, depression, and possibly a rise in post-traumatic stress disorders on a global scale. Rebuilding, a slow and difficult process. Finally, we come to the question of rebuilding. If the world's major cities disappeared overnight, could humanity recover? Rebuilding cities from scratch is no easy task. It took New York nearly 400 years to become the metropolis it is today. Tokyo's population boom occurred over decades of careful planning and development. Without the organizational frameworks that cities provide, rebuilding efforts would be slow and fraught with difficulties. Governments and corporations would have to cooperate on an unprecedented scale to restore global infrastructure. Yet, even with the best efforts, it would take decades, if not centuries, to reach the level of development and urbanization we see today. What's more, the lessons of history show that not all cities survive catastrophes. Some are abandoned entirely. Ancient cities like Pompeii, which were devastated by natural disasters, remain ghost towns. Could we see the rise of new urban hubs, or would humanity regress into a more rural, decentralized world? Only time would be able to tell. Conclusion: a world irrevocably changed. The sudden disappearance of the world's major cities would throw humanity into unprecedented chaos. Billions of lives would be lost, the global economy would collapse, and social, political, and psychological structures would be irreparably damaged. It's not just the physical spaces that would vanish, but also the cultural, technological, and economic systems that we depend on. However, it's important to remember that humanity has a remarkable ability to adapt and rebuild. While the loss of cities would mark an end to the world as we know it, it might also spark a new beginning. Communities would rise from the ashes, and new centers of human achievement might emerge. Perhaps the loss of cities would force humanity to reconsider its relationship with the environment, with technology, and with each other. In this new world, societies would likely be smaller, more localized, and possibly more sustainable. But the road to recovery would be long and fraught with challenges. The question is, would we emerge stronger from such a catastrophe, or would we crumble under the weight of loss? Ultimately, this thought experiment reminds us of the immense role cities play in shaping human civilization. They are more than just collections of buildings and people, they are the lifeblood of our global society. The disappearance of the world's major cities would be an unfathomable tragedy, but it would also offer an opportunity to rethink the foundations of our world.